The rain began falling in a steady rhythm, drumming softly against the roof and the wide windows of the old house. The air smelled of wet earth and faint mildew, the latter coming from the wooden beams and aging walls that held the house together. It was the kind of smell that lingered, weaving itself into every room, every creak of the floorboards, and every draft that slipped through the uneven gaps in the windows. Lucy tightened her grip on her backpack, shifting her weight from one foot to the other as she stood on the porch. Behind her, the car that had dropped her off disappeared down the gravel driveway, its headlights swallowed by the dense fog rolling in. She could hear the crunch of the tires fading, leaving her with only the sound of the rain and the faint rustling of the trees in the wind. She took a deep breath and knocked on the door. It opened almost instantly, as if someone had been standing there waiting. Ellie's familiar face appeared. A wide grin stretched across her freckled cheeks. Her messy red hair framed her face in a way that made her look perpetually carefree, and her oversized hoodie hung off her frame like it belonged to someone twice her size. "You made it," Ellie exclaimed, pulling Lucy inside before she could say a word. The warmth of the house hit her immediately, a stark contrast to the cool, damp air outside. The living room was lit by the soft glow of several lamps, their light casting long, flickering shadows on the faded floral wallpaper. A pile of blankets and pillows sat in the corner, evidence of Ellie's characteristic enthusiasm for sleepover preparations. "It's so gross out there," Lucy said, brushing droplets of rain from her jacket. She dropped her backpack near the pile of blankets. "I didn't think I'd make it through the fog." Ellie laughed, her voice echoing through the house. "Yeah, it gets like that sometimes. My parents call it soup fog. Thick enough to eat with a spoon, they say. Come on, we're setting up in the den." Lucy followed Ellie down the narrow hallway. The old wood beneath the rug creaked with every step, and Lucy couldn't help but notice how the shadows seemed to stretch and contract as they passed. The house was old, really old, and it had the sort of history that made people tell stories. Ellie had mentioned once that her grandparents had built it decades ago, but no one ever seemed to live there for long stretches of time. Lucy hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, with the rain tapping on the windows and the fog pressing against the glass like a living thing, the thought lingered in the back of her mind. The den was cozy, if not a little cluttered. A low coffee table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by a mismatched set of chairs and an old sofa that sagged in the middle. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their shelves crammed with books, framed photographs, and small knickknacks that seemed to hold sentimental value. A fire crackled in the small fireplace, filling the room with a faint, smoky scent. "I told the others you'd be here soon," Ellie said, flopping onto the sofa. "They're bringing snacks." Lucy sat down beside her, glancing around the room. She could hear faint voices and laughter coming from somewhere deeper in the house, but she couldn't tell exactly where. The sound seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it hard to pinpoint its source. "Who all is coming?" Lucy asked, tucking her legs beneath her. "Just us, Hannah and Mia," Ellie replied. "Mia's bringing popcorn, and Hannah's got those weird gummy worms she likes." Lucy nodded, relaxing a little. She'd known Ellie for years, and while she wasn't as close to Hannah and Mia, they were nice enough. It was comforting to know that she wasn't the only one feeling a little out of place in the big, creaky house. The sound of footsteps on the stairs drew Lucy's attention, and a moment later, Hannah and Mia appeared, their arms full of snacks and drinks. Hannah's curly dark hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her usual energy filled the room as she dropped her armload onto the table. Mia followed close behind, her quiet demeanor contrasting with Hannah's loud enthusiasm. The four girls settled in, chatting about school, TV shows, and the usual things that occupied their lives. The rain continued to fall outside, and the fog seemed to press closer, wrapping the house in its damp embrace. The fire in the fireplace crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and Lucy found herself growing more comfortable despite the strange atmosphere of the house. It wasn't until much later, after the snacks were eaten and the conversations had drifted into quiet murmurs, that Lucy noticed the sound. It was faint at first, so faint that she thought she'd imagined it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on glass. She glanced at the window, but the heavy curtains were drawn, blocking out any view of the outside. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others turned to her, their expressions curious but unconcerned. "Hear what?" Ellie asked. "That tapping," Lucy said. "It's coming from the window." Ellie frowned, leaning forward to listen. The room fell silent, the only sounds the crackling fire and the steady patter of rain. For a moment, Lucy thought maybe she'd imagined it after all. And then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Ellie's eyes widened slightly, but she shrugged. "It's probably just the wind or a tree branch. This old house makes noises like that all the time." Lucy nodded, but the uneasy feeling in her chest didn't go away. The sound had been too deliberate, too rhythmic. She forced herself to push the thought aside, turning her attention back to the conversation. But as the night wore on, the unease lingered. The house seemed to grow quieter, the shadows darker. The faint tapping came and went, never loud enough to be alarming, but persistent enough to keep Lucy's nerves on edge. And in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in the house. The fire in the den was dying down, leaving behind glowing embers that pulsed faintly in the dim light. Lucy pulled the edges of her blanket tighter around her shoulders, her gaze flickering toward the heavy curtains covering the windows. She hadn't heard the tapping again for a while, but the silence that filled the house now felt heavier, more oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Ellie and Mia were lying on the floor, their heads propped up on pillows as they scrolled through their phones. Hannah had disappeared into the kitchen a few minutes earlier, muttering something about looking for more snacks. The faint creaks and groans of the old house had become more frequent, or maybe Lucy was just paying closer attention now. Every noise, every shift in the shadows, felt magnified in the quiet. She tried to shake the feeling. "It's just an old house," she told herself. "Old houses make noise." It was a reasonable explanation, one she desperately wanted to believe. But the knot of unease in her stomach refused to loosen. Did anyone else feel like the fog outside looked weird? She asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Ellie glanced up from her phone. "Weird how?" Lucy hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know. Thicker maybe. Like it was alive or something." Mia laughed softly, but it was a nervous sound. "It's just fog, Lucy. It always looks weird at night." "Yeah, it's probably just your imagination," Ellie added, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, uncertainty maybe, that Lucy didn't miss. Before she could say anything else, a loud clatter echoed from the kitchen, followed by the sound of glass shattering. All three girls froze, their heads snapping toward the hallway. Lucy's heart jumped into her throat. "Hannah," Ellie called, her voice tentative. There was no response. The house was silent again, save for the faint crackle of the dying fire. "I'm sure she just dropped something," Mia said, though her voice wavered. Ellie pushed herself up from the floor, brushing crumbs off her hoodie. "I'll check on her." "I'll come with you," Lucy said quickly, not wanting to be left alone. The two girls made their way down the hallway, the old floorboards groaning beneath their weight. The air seemed colder here, and Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were pressing closer. When they reached the kitchen, the door was slightly ajar, and a faint draft seeped through the gap. "Hannah," Ellie called again, pushing the door open. The kitchen was empty, though the signs of Hannah's presence were obvious. A box of crackers sat open on the counter, and the broken remains of a glass lay scattered across the tile floor. A dark puddle of water, or maybe juice, spread out beneath the shards. "Where is she?" Lucy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ellie shrugged, though her face was pale. "Maybe she went to the bathroom." Lucy's eyes drifted toward the small window above the sink. The curtains were open, and beyond the glass, the fog turned in the faint glow of the porch light. It was thick and heavy, swirling in slow, deliberate movements that didn't seem natural. Lucy's breath caught in her throat as she stared, a shiver running down her spine. "Ellie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." Ellie turned, following Lucy's gaze. Her expression shifted from confusion to unease as she watched the fog twist and coil like something alive. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the oppressive silence wrapping around them like a vice. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, they heard a faint sound, a low, rhythmic creak, like the slow swing of a door on its hinges. Ellie's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes wide. "Did Mia leave the den?" she asked, her voice tight. Lucy shook her head. "I don't think so." The two girls exchanged a glance, the unspoken question hanging heavily between them. If it wasn't Mia, then who? Ellie grabbed a flashlight from the counter, flicking it on with a shaky hand. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow hallway beyond the kitchen. The creaking sound came again, louder this time, followed by a soft thud, like something heavy had been dropped. "We should go back to the den," Lucy said, her voice barely steady. Ellie nodded, but instead of retreating, she took a cautious step forward, her flashlight trained on the end of the hallway. "Hannah might need help," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. Reluctantly, Lucy followed, her hands balled into fists at her sides. The hallway stretched before them like a dark tunnel, the shadows seeming to move and shift just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. The creaking grew louder as they walked, the sound reverberating through the house in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. When they reached the den, the room was empty. The pile of blankets and pillows lay undisturbed, and Mia's phone sat abandoned on the sofa, its screen dark. "She was here," Lucy whispered, her voice tinged with panic. "She wouldn't just leave." Ellie's grip on the flashlight tightened. "Maybe she went looking for us." Before Lucy could respond, a sudden noise made them both jump. A soft, shuffling sound, like bare feet dragging across the floorboards. It was coming from the stairs. The two girls turned slowly, their eyes fixed on the staircase at the end of the hallway. The top of the stairs disappeared into darkness, the feeble glow of the flashlight barely reaching the first few steps. The shuffling continued, growing louder, closer, until it stopped abruptly. "Hello," Ellie called, her voice cracking. For a moment, there was no response, and then, from the shadows above, a faint whisper reached their ears. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, soft, pleading, and filled with an urgency that sent chills down Lucy's spine. "Ellie," Lucy whispered, tugging at her friend's sleeve, "we need to leave, now." But Ellie didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the staircase, her expression a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. Slowly, she took a step forward, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Wait," she said, her voice barely audible. "What if it's Hannah?" Lucy shook her head, panic rising in her chest. hesitated, her foot hovering over the first step. The whisper came again, louder this time, and for the briefest moment, Lucy thought she saw something, a faint pale shape shifting in the darkness at the top of the stairs. And then the whisper turned into a low, guttural moan. The sound that emanated from the darkness at the top of the stairs was unlike anything Lucy had ever heard. It wasn't human, not entirely, but it carried a strange, twisted mimicry of something alive. A guttural moan, low and ragged, almost like a voice trying to claw its way out of an abyss. Ellie froze, her foot still hovering over the first step. The flashlight shook in her trembling hand, its beam wobbling across the staircase. Lucy grabbed Ellie's arm, her nails digging into her friend's hoodie. "Ellie, we have to go," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. Ellie didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the darkness above, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Then, as the moan subsided into an eerie silence, something else stirred in the shadows. A faint scraping sound, like fingernails raking across wood, came from the top of the stairs. Lucy felt a cold sweat break out along her spine. Her heart pounded in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run, to get as far away from that staircase as possible. But her feet felt rooted to the floor, her body paralyzed by the overwhelming dread that seemed to seep from the very walls of the house. "Ellie," she tried again, her voice cracking. "Please." Finally, Ellie seemed to snap out of her trance. She turned to Lucy, her face pale and drawn, and nodded. Together, they backed away from the staircase, their movements slow and deliberate, as though any sudden motion might provoke whatever was lurking in the darkness. The moment they reached the hallway, Lucy grabbed Ellie's hand and started pulling her toward the front door. "We need to find Mia and Hannah and get out of here," she whispered urgently. Ellie didn't argue. The two of them moved quickly but cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the worn rug that ran the length of the hallway. The house felt different now, the air heavier, as if something unseen was watching their every move. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint rustle of fabric, seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. As they passed the den, Lucy glanced inside, half hoping to see Mia or Hannah waiting for them. But the room was as empty as before, the blankets and pillows undisturbed, Mia's phone still lying abandoned on the sofa. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of unease through her. Mia wouldn't have left her phone behind willingly. They continued down the hallway, heading for the kitchen where they'd last seen Hannah. The broken glass and spilled liquid were still there, glinting faintly in the light from Ellie's flashlight. But the room itself was empty, just as it had been before. "Where could they have gone?" Ellie whispered, her voice shaking. Lucy shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. She glanced around the kitchen, her eyes darting to every shadowed corner, every darkened doorway. The unease in her chest was growing, a heavy, suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, they heard it again, that same low, guttural moan. This time, it was closer. Lucy's stomach churned, and she felt Ellie's grip tighten around her hand. The sound wasn't coming from the stairs anymore. It was coming from the direction of the back hallway, where the bedrooms and the basement door were located. Ellie hesitated, glancing toward the hallway. "Do you think they're down there?" she whispered. Lucy wanted to scream no, to drag Ellie out of the house and leave everything behind. But the fear in Ellie's eyes stopped her. If there was even a chance that Mia or Hannah were in trouble, they couldn't just leave them. "Let's check the bedrooms first," Lucy said, her voice trembling. "Maybe they're hiding." Ellie nodded reluctantly, and the two of them moved toward the hallway, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead. The The wooden floor creaked beneath their feet, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. The hallway felt colder than the rest of the house, and the faint smell of mildew hung heavy in the air. They reached the first bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Ellie pushed it open with trembling fingers, the flashlight illuminating the small, cluttered room. It was empty. The bed was unmade, clothes were strewn across the floor, and the window was shut tight, the curtains drawn. The second bedroom was the same, empty and undisturbed, as if no one had set foot inside in years. When they reached the basement door, Lucy felt her stomach drop. The door was slightly open, just enough to reveal the top of the staircase leading down into pitch blackness. The faint smell of damp earth wafted up from below, mingling with the sour tang of something metallic. Ellie swallowed hard, shining the flashlight into the opening. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, the shadows seeming to swallow the light whole. "Do you think they went down there?" Ellie asked, her voice barely audible. Lucy shook her head. "I don't know, but I don't." A sudden noise cut her off, a loud crashing sound, like something heavy being knocked over, followed by a series of rapid thuds. It came from the basement. Ellie jumped, her flashlight shaking violently. What the hell was that? Lucy didn't answer. Her mind was racing, panic clawing at her chest. She couldn't imagine any reason why Mia or Hannah would have gone down there, and the thought of following that sound made her blood run cold. But before she could say anything, Ellie took a step forward, her jaw set in determination. "If they're down there, we can't just leave them." "Ellie, wait," Lucy pleaded, grabbing her friend's arm. "We don't know what's down there." Ellie hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. But before she could respond, another sound echoed up from the basement. A faint whispering voice, soft and fragmented, like wind passing through cracks in the walls. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was familiar, desperate, pleading. It sounded like Hannah. Ellie's expression hardened, and she pulled away from Lucy's grip. "We have to check," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. Lucy's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Ellie reach for the basement door. The air seemed to grow colder with every passing second, the oppressive silence pressing in around them like a living thing. She wanted to stop Ellie, to drag her away from that dark, gaping void, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. Ellie stepped through the doorway, the beam of her flashlight cutting a narrow path down the staircase. She paused at the top, glancing back at Lucy. "Are you coming?" Lucy hesitated, her throat dry. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave the house and never look back. But the fear of losing her friends was stronger. With a shaky breath, she stepped forward, following Ellie into the darkness. The basement air was thick and damp, the walls lined with crumbling concrete that seemed to close in around them. The narrow staircase creaked beneath their weight, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the space. As they descended, the whispers grew louder, mingling with the rhythmic thud of their footsteps. Lucy couldn't tell if the voices were real or if her mind was playing tricks on her, but the sense of dread was almost unbearable. She clung to Ellie, her eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement at the edges of the flashlight's beam. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. The basement stretched out before them, a cavernous void lit only by the trembling beam of Ellie's flashlight. The air down here was colder than Lucy had expected, unnaturally so, and carried a damp, metallic tang that clung to her throat with each shallow breath. The walls seemed to lean inward, their crumbling concrete surface streaked with dark stains that could have been water or something far worse. Ellie stood a few paces ahead, her grip on the flashlight tight enough to make her knuckles turn white. She was frozen, staring into the darkness basement was suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of their breathing and the distant, rhythmic drip of water. "Do you see anything?" Lucy whispered, though the words felt too loud, as if they might provoke something hidden in the shadows. Ellie didn't answer immediately. Her flashlight swept slowly across the space, illuminating piles of forgotten junk, old furniture draped in dusty sheets, rusting metal tools scattered on a workbench, and boxes sagging under years of neglect. The beam wavered, catching on the far corner of the room where a large, dark shape loomed. "What is that?" Ellie murmured, taking a cautious step forward. Lucy didn't want to know. Her feet remained planted on the bottom step of the staircase, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that she was certain Ellie could hear it too. "Ellie, don't," she said, her voice trembling. "Let's just go back upstairs." But Ellie didn't stop. She edged closer to the shape, and as the flashlight beam steadied, Lucy saw what it was. A wardrobe, ancient and imposing, its wooden surface cracked and scarred with age. It stood alone, leaning slightly to one side, as if the weight of the years had been too much for it to bear. "Why would anyone keep this down here?" Ellie asked, her voice tight with unease. Lucy didn't answer. She was too focused on the wardrobe, on the way its shadow seemed to stretch farther than the light should have allowed. It looked wrong, out of place, as though it didn't belong in the basement, or anywhere for that matter. Ellie reached out, her hand hovering over the ornate handle. "Maybe there's something inside," she said, more to herself than to Lucy. "Ellie, don't," Lucy pleaded, stepping off the stairs at last. "Please." But Ellie's fingers closed around the handle before Lucy could stop her. With a sharp creak, she pulled the wardrobe door open. The flashlight beam wavered as Ellie stepped back, her breath hitching in her throat. The wardrobe was empty. At least, it seemed that way at first. The interior was dark and bare, lined with splintered wood that smelled faintly of decay. But as Ellie shone her flashlight inside, Lucy noticed something. Scratches. Long, jagged lines carved deep into the wood, running in chaotic patterns across every surface. They didn't look like marks made by tools or machinery. They looked like claw marks. "What the hell?" Ellie whispered, trailing off as she leaned in closer. Lucy grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Don't. Please, Ellie. Let's just go." But Ellie didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on something at the back of the wardrobe, something Lucy hadn't noticed at first. A small circular hole, no larger than a fist, carved into the wood. The edges of the hole were uneven, as though it had been chewed away by something desperate to get out, or to get in. "Do you hear that?" Ellie asked suddenly, her voice barely audible. Lucy's breath caught in her throat. She strained her ears, but at first, she heard nothing. And then it came, a faint, irregular sound, like the rustling of fabric or the scrape of something soft against wood. It was coming from inside the wardrobe. Ellie stepped back, her flashlight still trained on the dark interior. The rustling grew louder, more insistent, and Lucy felt her stomach twist with fear. She wanted to run, to bolt up the stairs and never look back, but her legs refused to move. And then, abruptly, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. Lucy's eyes darted toward the wardrobe, half expecting something to lunge out from the shadows. But nothing happened. The wardrobe remained still, its doors hanging open like a yawning mouth. Ellie turned to Lucy, her face pale and drawn. "We need to close it," she said, her voice shaking. "Whatever's in there, we can't leave it open." Lucy nodded, though every fiber of her being screamed against going anywhere near that thing. Together, they stepped forward, Ellie gripping the edge of the door while Lucy hovered nearby, her hands clenched into fists. As Ellie pushed though it didn't want to be closed. And then, just as the door clicked into place, the moan came again. It was louder this time, deeper, vibrating through the very walls of the basement. Lucy stumbled back, her hands flying to her ears as the sound reverberated through her skull. Ellie dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly across the floor as the moan gave way to a series of low, guttural whispers. Lucy couldn't understand the words, if they were even words at all, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, hungry, and filled with an overwhelming sense of malice. She grabbed Ellie's arm, yanking her toward the stairs. "Run!" she screamed, her voice hoarse with panic. Ellie didn't hesitate. The two of them bolted up the staircase, their footsteps thundering against the wooden steps. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second, until they reached the top and slammed the door shut behind them. For a moment, they stood there, panting and clutching at each other, their backs pressed against the door, as though that alone could keep whatever was in the basement from following them. The house was eerily quiet again, but the oppressive feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger now, as though the entire house had come alive with a malevolent energy. "We need to find the others," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucy nodded, though she had no idea where to start. The thought of searching the rest of the house filled her with dread, but leaving Mia and Hannah behind was unthinkable. Summoning what little courage she had left, she followed Ellie back into the hallway. The house felt different now. The shadows were deeper, darker, and seemed to shift in ways that defied explanation. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint rustle of movement, set Lucy's nerves on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something was watching them, stalking them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As they turned the corner, heading back toward the den, Lucy caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A figure, pale and indistinct, standing at the far end of the hallway. She froze, grabbing Ellie's arm and pointing. But when Ellie turned the flashlight in that direction, the figure was gone. "Did you see it?" Lucy whispered, her voice shaking. Ellie nodded slowly, her face pale. "We're not alone," she said, her voice barely audible. Lucy didn't need to be told. She could feel it now, a heavy, suffocating presence that filled the air around them. Whatever was in the house with them, it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The silence in the hallway was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of Ellie's trembling breath and the muted creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. Lucy's pulse roared in her ears as she clung to Ellie's arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of her friend's hoodie. The air was thick and stifling, pressing down on them with an oppressive weight that seemed to seep from the very walls of the house. Every shadow seemed to writhe with unseen movement, and every faint sound felt magnified in the dark. Ellie's flashlight wavered as she scanned the hallway again, her hand shaking uncontrollably. "It was right there," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of Lucy's heart. "I swear, I saw it." Lucy nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She had seen it too, something pale and indistinct, standing just beyond the edge of the light. It hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, but its presence was unmistakable. And now it was gone, swallowed by the shadows that seemed to grow deeper and more menacing with each passing second. "We can't stay here," Lucy finally managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "We have to find Mia and Hannah and get out." Ellie nodded, though her expression was pale and uncertain. "Where do we look? They're not in the den, and the kitchen was empty." Lucy hesitated, glancing back toward the basement door at the far end of the hallway. The memory of the guttural whispers and the icy presence from below sent a fresh wave of terror through her. but she forced herself to focus. "Maybe they're upstairs," she said, though the words felt hollow. She wasn't sure she believed it, but the thought of going back toward the basement was unbearable. Ellie didn't argue. Together, they turned toward the staircase at the center of the house, their movements slow and deliberate as they tried to make as little noise as possible. The old wooden steps groaned under their weight, each creak sending a jolt of fear through Lucy's chest. The flashlight's beam flickered, casting distorted shadows on the walls as they ascended. When they reached the top of the stairs, the air grew colder still, and the faint scent of mildew mingled with something sharper, something that made Lucy's stomach churn. The hallway stretched out before them, lined with closed doors that seemed to loom taller and darker than they should. The faint glow of moonlight filtered through a single cracked window at the far end, casting pale, uneven light across the worn carpet. "Which one do we check first?" Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. Lucy glanced at the nearest door, its surface warped and splintered with age. She couldn't explain it, but she felt an almost magnetic pull toward it, as though something was waiting on the other side. Her mouth went dry as she reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. "Wait," Ellie said suddenly, grabbing Lucy's wrist. "Do you hear that?" Lucy froze, straining her ears. For a moment, she heard nothing but the faint hum of the wind outside. But then, slowly, a sound began to emerge. A soft, rhythmic thumping, like the steady beat of a heart. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was coming from behind the door. Lucy's hand recoiled as though burned, and she took a step back, shaking her head. "We shouldn't," she whispered. "We need to keep moving." Ellie hesitated, her flashlight beam lingering on the door. Her breathing quickened, and Lucy could see the conflict in her eyes, the same fear and uncertainty that Lucy felt. But after a moment, Ellie nodded, stepping away from the door and motioning for Lucy to follow her farther down the hall. The thumping grew quieter as they moved away, but it didn't fade entirely. It seemed to follow them, faint and persistent, like an echo that refused to die. Lucy tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the next door they passed. This one was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of darkness visible through the crack. Ellie gestured for Lucy to stay back, then pushed the door open with a trembling hand. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small, cluttered bedroom. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. A single bed sat in the corner, its covers tangled and stained, as though someone had left in a hurry. "It's empty," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's check the next one." Lucy nodded, but as they turned to leave, something caught her eye. A faint impression in the dust on the floor. It was small and narrow, like the mark of a bare foot, and it wasn't alone. A second, then a third print appeared, leading away from the bed and toward the far corner of the room. "Ellie," Lucy said, her voice trembling. "Look." Ellie followed her gaze, the flashlight beam jerking toward the prints. They stopped at the base of the wall, where the wallpaper had peeled away to reveal a small square opening. It was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, and the darkness beyond it was absolute. "What is that?" Ellie whispered, stepping closer. Lucy shook her head, her stomach churning. "I don't know, but we shouldn't." Before she could finish, a soft, raspy whisper echoed from the opening, cutting through the silence like a blade. It was faint and unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, and filled with a chilling sense of urgency. Ellie stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Now." Lucy didn't argue. They backed out of the room, closing the door behind them as though it might somehow keep whatever was in there from following them. The hallway felt darker now, the shadows heavier and more oppressive. Lucy's pulse thundered in her ears as they moved toward the next door, each step feeling like it carried them deeper into the heart of something terrible. As they reached the last door at the end of the hall, Lucy felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The door was different from the others, newer, with a smooth surface that stood out starkly against the aged wood around it. It was locked, the handle gleaming faintly in the dim light. Ellie tried the handle anyway, jiggling it with increasing urgency. "It won't budge," she said, frustration and fear evident in her voice. "Leave it," Lucy urged. "It's locked for a reason." But Ellie wasn't listening. She crouched down, shining the flashlight on the keyhole as though searching for a way to open it. Lucy's stomach twisted as she glanced back down the hallway, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows. Then, from behind the locked door, they heard it. A faint, hollow knock. The knock was soft at first, almost hesitant, as if testing their reaction. The sound barely registered in Lucy's mind at first, her pulse pounding too loudly in her ears. But then it came again, firmer this time, a deliberate rhythm that sent a shiver down her spine. Ellie froze, her hand still hovering near the keyhole, the flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the smooth surface of the door. "Did you hear that?" Ellie whispered, her voice tight with barely contained panic. Lucy nodded, unable to speak. She felt a rising nausea in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing certainty that whatever was behind that door was not meant to be disturbed. Her instincts screamed for her to run, to leave Ellie and this cursed house behind, but her legs refused to move. The knock came a third time, louder now, with an almost impatient cadence. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong in a house like this, where every other noise was muffled, dampened by the oppressive stillness that clung to every corner. This sound was alive, deliberate, and wrong. "Who's there?" Ellie called, her voice trembling as she leaned closer to the door. Lucy wanted to grab her, to drag her back, but her own fear kept her rooted in place. The air around them felt heavier now, colder, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity as they waited for a response. And then it came. Not a voice, but a sound. A low, guttural scraping, like nails dragging across wood. The noise started behind the door and moved downward, slowly, deliberately, until it stopped at the base of the frame. Lucy felt her throat tighten as the sound changed, shifting to a soft, wet squelch, as though something was pressing against the other side of the door. "Ellie, stop," Lucy hissed, her voice breaking. "We need to go, now." Ellie hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the door again. "What if it's them?" she whispered, glancing back at Lucy. "What if it's Mia or Hannah?" Lucy shook her head vehemently, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "That's not them," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, Ellie, let's just leave." But Ellie didn't move. Her gaze remained fixed on the door, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. Slowly, she reached for the handle again, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The flashlight's beam flickered, casting erratic shadows across the hallway as Lucy's stomach churned with dread. Before Ellie could turn the handle, the knocking resumed, this time from the other side of the hallway. Both girls spun around, their breaths hitching in unison. The flashlight's beam swept across the corridor, but there was nothing there. The knocking continued, echoing faintly from somewhere farther down the hall, as though it was coming from another door, or perhaps the walls themselves. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and impossibly close. Lucy's knees felt weak as as she clutched Ellie's arm, her voice a frantic whisper. "Ellie, we're not alone. Please, we have to get out of here." Ellie finally seemed to register the panic in Lucy's voice. She nodded shakily, stepping back from the locked door and motioning for Lucy to follow her. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the worn carpet, but the oppressive weight in the air seemed to follow them, pressing down with every step. As they reached the top of the stairs, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and Lucy couldn't help but glance back over her shoulder, half expecting to see something, anything, emerging from the darkness. But the hallway remained empty, its shadows undisturbed. "Where now?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucy hesitated, glancing down the staircase. The thought of descending into the lower levels of the house filled her with dread, but staying upstairs felt even worse. She took a shaky breath, trying to steady her nerves. "We'll check the den again," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe they went back there." Ellie nodded, though her expression made it clear she didn't believe it any more than Lucy did. They descended the stairs together, each creak of the wood beneath their feet echoing in the suffocating stillness. The air grew warmer as they reached the ground floor, but the sense of unease remained, coiling around them like a living thing. When they entered the den, Lucy felt her stomach drop. The room was empty, just as it had been before, but something was different now. The blankets and pillows that had been piled neatly in the corner were scattered across the floor, as though someone, or something, had rifled through them in a frenzy. Mia's phone was gone. "Didn't you see it here earlier?" Ellie asked, her voice low and strained. Lucy nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She stepped forward cautiously, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The fire in the hearth had burned out completely, leaving only cold, blackened logs behind. The faint scent of smoke lingered in the air, mingling with the metallic tang that Lucy had noticed upstairs. A faint sound drew her attention, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. It was coming from the far side of the room, near the window. Lucy's heart raced as she turned toward the sound, her eyes straining to see through the dim light. The curtains were moving. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the air in the room was perfectly still. The fabric swayed gently, as though something was brushing against it from the other side. Lucy's breath caught in her throat as Ellie stepped forward, her flashlight aimed at the window. "Don't," Lucy whispered, her voice trembling. Ellie ignored her. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against the edge of the curtain. The fabric shifted beneath her touch, revealing a sliver of the window beyond. The glass was fogged over, obscuring whatever might be outside, but there was a faint, dark shape pressed against it. Ellie pulled the curtain back farther, and the shape moved. Lucy screamed, stumbling backward as the flashlight fell from Ellie's hand, the beam spinning wildly across the floor. The shape on the other side of the window was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its pale face was pressed against the glass, empty black eyes staring unblinkingly into the room. And then it smiled. The smile was wrong. It stretched too wide, exposing teeth that were jagged and uneven, like shards of broken glass shoved into a crooked jaw. The figure remained motionless, its hollow black eyes fixed on Ellie as she stumbled backward, her hands clawing at the air in a futile attempt to find something solid to grasp. The curtain fell back into place, obscuring the window again, but the image of that face burned into Lucy's mind, leaving a hollow ache of dread in its wake. Ellie's flashlight lay abandoned on the floor, its beam casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the walls like mocking specters. Lucy's breathing was ragged, her chest tightening as panic clawed at her insides. violently, but Ellie wasn't moving. She stood frozen, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the curtain as though the figure might reappear at any moment. "Ellie," Lucy whispered hoarsely, her voice cracking. "Ellie, we have to go." Ellie didn't respond. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Her hands hung limply at her sides, her shoulders trembling as if she were barely holding herself together. Lucy grabbed her by the arm, shaking her roughly. "Ellie," she said, louder this time, her voice thick with desperation. "Snap out of it." Ellie blinked, her head jerking toward Lucy, as though she had only just realized she was there. Her face was pale, her freckles standing out starkly against her ashen skin. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, a low, broken sob escaped her lips, and she sank to her knees, clutching her head in her hands. Lucy knelt beside her, fighting the urge to panic. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make this stop, but staying in the den felt like a death sentence. She glanced toward the window again, half expecting to see the figure still standing there, but the curtain was still, the glass hidden behind a veil of fabric. "We can't stay here," Lucy said, her voice trembling as she tried to keep it steady. "Ellie, please get up. We have to find Mia and Hannah." Ellie's sobs grew quieter, her breathing shallow and uneven. Slowly, she lifted her head, her tear-streaked face contorted with fear. "It smiled," she choked out, her voice barely audible. "Did you see it? It smiled." Lucy nodded, her stomach twisting painfully at the memory. "I saw it, but it's gone now, okay? We're going to get out of here. We just need to move." Ellie hesitated, her hands shaking as she wiped her face. She looked at Lucy, her eyes hollow and full of questions she couldn't bring herself to ask. After a moment, she nodded, forcing herself to her feet. Her movements were stiff and unsteady, like a puppet being guided by invisible strings. The flashlight lay on the floor between them, its beam flickering weakly. Lucy picked it up, clutching it tightly, as though it might somehow ward off whatever was stalking them. She glanced around the room one last time, her gaze lingering on the window before turning toward the hallway. The house seemed even darker now, the shadows heavier and more oppressive than before. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and something else, something acrid and metallic that made Lucy's throat burn with each breath. She kept the flashlight trained ahead, the beam barely cutting through the gloom. "Where do we go now?" Ellie asked, her voice hoarse and trembling. Lucy hesitated, her mind racing. They had checked the den, the kitchen, and the bedrooms upstairs. The only place they hadn't looked was the basement, but the thought of returning to that suffocating darkness filled her with a primal, overwhelming terror. Before she could answer, a sound echoed through the hallway, a faint, uneven tapping, like the shuffle of bare feet against the wooden floor. It was distant at first, but it grew louder with each passing second, the irregular rhythm sending chills racing down Lucy's spine. "Did you hear that?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucy nodded, her grip tightening on the flashlight. She turned toward the sound, the beam trembling as it illuminated the empty hallway. The tapping continued, closer now, accompanied by a faint, raspy breathing that sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. It was coming from the direction of the basement door. "Let's go the other way," Lucy said, her voice shaking as she grabbed Ellie's arm and pulled her toward the front door. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the worn carpet beneath their feet. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as though whatever was making the sound had realized they were trying to leave. The raspy breathing grew louder too, interspersed with a low, guttural sound that Lucy couldn't identify. When they reached the front door, Lucy's heart sank. The chain lock was in place, the latch twisted tightly into the whispered, her voice tight with panic. "It's coming." Lucy's fingers slipped on the chain, the metal biting into her skin as she struggled to free it. The tapping was almost upon them now, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. She could feel it, the cold, malevolent presence pressing against her back, its shadow looming over them like a living thing. Finally, the chain came loose, and Lucy yanked the door open. Cold, damp air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of rain and wet earth. She grabbed Ellie's hand, pulling her through the doorway and into the fog-drenched night. They stumbled down the porch steps, the flashlight beam cutting erratically through the mist. The fog was so thick that Lucy could barely see more than a few feet ahead, the world around them reduced to shifting shadows and muted silhouettes. She could hear Ellie's labored breathing behind her, each gasp ragged and uneven. "Keep going," Lucy urged, her voice tight with fear. "Don't stop." Ellie nodded, her grip on Lucy's hand tightening as they moved through the fog. The house loomed behind them, its dark silhouette fading into the mist with each step. But the sense of being watched remained, the cold, suffocating presence following them like a predator stalking its prey. Then, from somewhere in the fog, a sound emerged, a soft, haunting whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was faint and fragmented, the words impossible to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the same voice they had heard in the basement. Lucy's stomach twisted as she tightened her grip on the flashlight, her heart racing. She didn't dare stop, didn't dare look back, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent, as though it was drawing closer with each passing second. And then, through the thick haze of the fog, Lucy saw it, a faint pale shape standing motionless in their path. The pale shape in the fog seemed to hover, its form indistinct, yet undeniably human. It was taller than it should have been, its limbs unnaturally elongated, and its edges blurred as though the mist itself was holding it together. The figure didn't move, but Lucy could feel its gaze fixed on her, an invisible pressure that made her skin crawl and her knees weaken. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she tightened her grip on Ellie's hand. Ellie stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes locked on the figure ahead. "Lucy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you see it?" Lucy nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Her mind screamed for her to run, to pull Ellie away from whatever nightmare stood before them, but her legs felt heavy, as though the damp ground beneath them was trying to swallow her whole. The figure shifted. It didn't step forward, didn't lurch or reach out, but somehow it was closer, the fog rippling around its pale form, as though it were part of the air itself. Lucy's flashlight flickered, its beam struggling to pierce through the thick mist, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, the light illuminated the figure's face. It had no features. Its surface was smooth and pale, like wax left too close to a flame, and its head tilted unnaturally to one side, as though trying to understand the two girls standing frozen before it. There were no eyes, no mouth, but the sense of being watched, scrutinized, was suffocating. Ellie took a shaky step back, her hand trembling in Lucy's grasp. What is it?" she stammered, her voice breaking. Lucy couldn't answer. Her heart thundered in her chest as she finally found the strength to move, tugging Ellie's arm and pulling her away from the figure. "We have to go," she managed to whisper, her voice barely steady. "Now." They turned and ran, their footsteps crunching against the gravel as they stumbled blindly through the fog. The air grew colder with each step, the mist clinging to their skin like icy fingers. Lucy kept the flashlight pointed ahead, the beam flickering wildly as they navigated the unfamiliar terrain. She had no idea where they were going, only that they needed to get as far each passing second. The words were unintelligible, a twisted jumble of sounds that seemed to burrow into Lucy's mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a vice. She risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately regretted it. The figure was following them. It moved silently, gliding through the fog with an eerie grace, its elongated limbs bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. It wasn't running, but it was faster than it should have been, the distance between them shrinking with every step. Lucy's stomach twisted as she turned her gaze forward again, her lungs burning as she urged Ellie to keep running. The whispers grew louder still, and now they were joined by something else. A faint, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat echoing through the fog. The sound vibrated in Lucy's chest, matching the frantic rhythm of her own pulse. It was everywhere, surrounding them, pressing in from all sides. Ellie stumbled, nearly pulling Lucy down with her as she caught herself against a low, moss-covered stone. She let out a strangled cry, her ankle twisting awkwardly as she tried to push herself back to her feet. Lucy dropped to her knees beside her, her hands trembling as she shone the flashlight around them, searching desperately for any sign of safety. They were in a clearing now, the ground beneath them soft and damp. The fog had thinned slightly, revealing the outlines of tall skeletal trees that loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like clawed hands. In the center of the clearing stood an old, crumbling well, its stone surface covered in patches of moss and lichen. The air around it felt different, heavier, colder, as though the well itself was alive. Ellie clutched at her ankle, her face contorted with pain. "I can't," she gasped, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I can't run anymore." Lucy's chest tightened as she looked back toward the fog. The figure was closer now, its pale form barely visible through the shifting mist. The whispers and the thumping had grown so loud that they seemed to echo inside her skull, drowning out all other thought. "We'll hide," Lucy said, her voice trembling as she grabbed Ellie's arm and helped her to her feet. "We'll hide by the well." Ellie didn't argue. She leaned heavily on Lucy as they stumbled toward the crumbling structure, each step feeling slower and more labored than the last. The air around the well grew colder still, the metallic tang in the air almost overwhelming as they collapsed behind its jagged edge, the stones digging into their backs. Lucy turned off the flashlight, plunging them into darkness. The whispers continued, swirling around them like a living thing, but the figure didn't appear immediately. She held her breath, her heart hammering as she strained to listen, every muscle in her body tense. Then, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of Ellie's ragged breathing. Lucy felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. She didn't dare move, didn't dare speak, as though the smallest sound might give them away. And then, from somewhere above them, a new sound emerged. A soft, wet slithering, like something dragging itself across the ground. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, closer, with each passing second. Lucy's stomach twisted as she realized the sound wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from inside the well. Ellie let out a choked sob, her hand clutching Lucy's arm with a desperate strength. Lucy tried to pull away, to move, but her body refused to obey. Her gaze was fixed on the edge of the well, where a pale, elongated hand was now reaching up, its fingers curling over the moss-covered stone. The hand was followed by another, and then a head. It was the same smooth, featureless face they had seen at the window, its head tilting unnaturally as it hauled itself up from the darkness. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though savoring the moment. Lucy's mind screamed at her to run, to do anything but sit there and watch. but her body was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming terror of the thing climbing out of the well. The figure's elongated limbs twisted and contorted as it emerged, its pale form glistening with a slick black substance that dripped onto the ground below. Ellie's breathing grew faster, more panicked, and Lucy knew they couldn't stay hidden any longer. She grabbed the flashlight, her hands trembling as she fumbled to turn it back on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the figure in stark, horrifying detail. It stopped moving